All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. So we are picking up in Meir Hashem in Tzidkas HaTzaddik in Os Ayin Aleph. This is our third shir on this particular Os. Meir Hashem will finish it today. By way of review, we're picking up. If you're following on the handout that I sent out in the WhatsApp chat, we're on Daf Kuf Ayin. In the Be'urei HaChasidus, we're going to begin in the bottom left-hand corner. So remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, Rabbi Tzaddik introduced this os with the idea, first of all, of the concept of yitamu chatoim v'lo yitamu chotim. The idea being that people are good, but all too often good people do bad things. So therefore, says the Rebbe, when we daven, we don't daven for the sinner to cease to exist. Rather, we daven for the sin to cease to exist. Again, he quoted the story by Bruya and Rabbi Meir. Okay, but then the Rebbe went on to explain this interesting idea that one is permitted to go ahead and daven to HaKodesh Baruch Hu to punish the individual who is Ra Bein Adam Lechavero. Right? Remember again, a person could have two levels of their persona. Bein Adam Lemakom, Bein Adam Lechavero. A person who goes ahead and is Ra in his Bein Adam Lemakom. Ultimately, again, a person should not daven for such a person for such an individual to be punished. Rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like Rabbi Meir did, should daven for the person to do tshuva. But if a person is ra lebrios, if a person ultimately harms others, a person negatively impacts others, a person is compromised in their ben adam lechavero, then a person is permitted to daven for that individual to be judged and punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe proved this point from the story with Elisha Hanavi, and also proved it from the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha. Interestingly enough, where we left off with on Friday was the bottom, as I mentioned before, the bottom of Kuf Ayin in the Be'urei HaChasidus, left-hand column, last couple of lines. So the Rebbe said, however, in order to do this, in order to daven for someone who is ra lebrios, someone who is bad in his interpersonal conduct, to be judged and punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in order to do that, a person has to have a complete view, a complete understanding of who the individual is, i.e., Ruach HaKodesh. Elisha is Ruach HaKodesh. He could daven, Vayifin Kov, right? Elisha looked, he saw nothing redeeming in these individuals. If you have Ruach HaKodesh, so you can go ahead and you could daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go ahead and judge someone. V'ulam, last couple of lines. V'ulam, misha ino ba Ruach HaKodesh, but someone who does not possess Ruach HaKodesh, yesh lo lachshosh v'li manamil kalam. Such a person should refrain from cursing another individual. Al af shenira lo sha'adam zeh ra lebrios, umutar lekalalo ulevakesh es ra'aso, shema efshar shanagia belibo, Machmas shetzira adam zeh, hi ma'avarto, umonaas mimenu lishbot karoi be'enei sichlo, in adam zeh achein ra lebrios. So the Rebbe here says something amazing. Remember, let's contextualize this a little bit. When we speak about the fact that I'm going to go ahead and daven for someone that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should judge an individual who is ra lebrios, right? This person is terrible in his interpersonal conduct. Who is he terrible to? B'pashtos, who is he terrible to? To me. To me. That's what's happening over here, right? Even the example of Elisha. Someone wronged Elisha. Elisha ultimately brought punishment upon that individual. So B'pashtos, says the Rebbe, what we're talking about over here is someone really wrongs me. Objectively wrongs me. So we've now seen a concept where I am permitted to go ahead and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the Ribono Shel Olam to punish this individual because of the negative behavior that he has engaged in that has negatively impacted me. Just as an aside, you see from this, I'm sure I mentioned this last week, but it's kedai to repeat it. The whole yisod over here is how seriously HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes our ben adam lechavero behavior. That it is not just enough to be proficient ben adam lemakom between yourself and God, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu really looks at how we interact and how we treat one another. So if I mistreat God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could handle it. But I mistreat people, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, to a certain degree, the stakes are much higher when you hurt other human beings, when you hurt other Jews. So the Rebbe says something amazing. The problem, therefore again, in this model, I am permitted to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the Ribono Shel Olam to visit punishment upon the person who is not behaving appropriately and has been Adam L'Chaveiro. Says the Rebbe, unless you have Ruach HaKodesh, don't do it. Why? Because Lamaisa, how do you know that your intentions are really correct? Especially if you are the aggrieved party, especially if you are the victim, especially if you are the one who has been hurt. How do you know that you're really seeing things for what they are? How do you know that as a result of your pain, your entire perception of things may be colored? His lashon is so profound. He says, Efshar shanigia ma'avarto. Your negios, the fact that you are personally involved in this situation, ma'avarto, blinds you. And who's to say you're really able to see this situation for what it is? But say, what an incredibly profound yesod on a variety of levels. First of all, again, just sticking to the subject over here, whereas the Rebbe introduces a model in which it is permitted to daven for another Jew to be judged and even punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu for his misdeeds in the realm of Ben Adam L'Chaveiro, the Rebbe says practically, only do it if you have Ruach HaKodesh. Why? Because when we are hurt by other people, our entire perception of reality vis-a-vis that person is skewed. Most of you all know this. You know, there are people with whom, we all have this, with whom you've had negative interactions. Right? People who just, whether they're nasty, they're mean, they've done something objectively that is just wrong. Every single time that person starts walking towards you, what happens? You tense up. And every single thing that person says, right, is heard through a certain filter. That's the way life works, right? You go ahead and you perceive people based on the reality of past circumstances. So says the Rebbe, can you really, if you've had a negative interaction with someone, can you ever really look at another interaction impartially? Can you really ever be objective? Can you really ever see things for what they are? Or does your pain color every single thing? And therefore says the Rebbe, although it is true that this situation of davening for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to judge someone does actually exist, L'maisa, doing it in the absence of Ruach HaKodesh and explicit clarity to see a situation for what it is, don't do it. The Rebbe goes on, he says, page Kuf Ayin Aleph, we'll do this piece and we'll stop for today. The Rebbe says, Ume'achar shetzarach lahotzi milibo hanegios, kodem shegomer bedaito, shura lebrios umuta lekallo. So therefore says the Rebbe, because a person has to go ahead and remove any negios. Negios means like any, I guess we'll call it like conflict of interest, right? I have to remove any conflict of interest from my heart. I have to make sure that I'm able to see things for what they really are. Before, number one, I judge someone to be ra lebrios, and number two, curse them. He says, lekach, David HaMelech alav shalom ba'osa mizmar, hamuv la'el, amar alatzma al saposek, v'libi chalal b'kirbi. See, Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. Another example of cursing people who are ra lebrios, who behave negatively, another example of that is David HaMelech. You know, in Sefer Tehillim, there are examples of David HaMelech cursing his enemies. And his enemies are not non-Jews. His enemies are members of Klal Yisrael. So how is David able to go ahead and curse other people? So again, that's the Rebbe's model. When someone is ra lebrios, when someone behaves in a way that hurts other people, you are permitted to go ahead and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to intervene, to judge, and even to curse that person. But David says, before I did that, what happened? V'libi chalal b'kirbi, which literally means my heart was hollow inside of me. What does that mean? Says the Rebbe, quotes the Yerushalmi, Shahargo David HaMelech Yetzahara. It's hard to even understand what this means. David HaMelech slaughtered his Yetzahara. Right? David HaMelech came to a point in life where he was able to totally overcome his Yetzahara. Uperush Kavanaso, Hainu Sha'amar David, Shemuter lo lekalal esonov, mipnei she'in lo lachosh l'shum negia, shemahu osekin l'tavas asmo. So you see David HaMelech, before he judges another person, and certainly before he curses another person, what happens? He says, Ribono Shalom, I've shechted my Yetzirah. I've shechted my Yetzirah. Because that's the level that a person has to be on prior to going ahead and judging and cursing another individual, even for what may be objectively the most egregious behavior. So I will say, if we bring this all together, with this we'll stop for today, but if you bring this all together, the Rebbe really develops an incredible model, which highlights a number of lessons, even though what the Rebbe is suggesting in actuality is not lamaisa, as the Rebbe himself explains. So number one, I will say, we see that what? That at the end of the day, how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at someone who's ra lebrios, someone who is compromised in their bein adam lechavero. The Ribono Shel Olam could go ahead and handle a lot if I'm not good in my bein adam lemakom. But the moment I begin to mistreat individuals, the moment I begin to trample upon the dignity of another Jew, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says opens me up to klala. And in fact, says the Rebbe, if I see someone who is ra lebrios, I have the right to go ahead and daven for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to curse such an individual. So lesson number one, how seriously we have to take our ben adam l'chavero, and how seriously we have to take how we treat our fellow Jew, and even things that may not seem so significant to us, if it tramples the dignity, tramples the feeling of another, to go ahead and abstain. Lesson number two, says the Rebbe, but don't curse unless you know that you are seeing things for what they are, and you have objectively true clarity. Meaning what? So says Rabbi, either you have Ruach HaKodesh, or you've slaughtered your Yetzirah. So either if you have no Yetzirah or Ruach HaKodesh, then you could stand in judgment of another. But if I don't possess either of those things, which b'pashtos most of us don't, right? Just understand, you rarely see things for what they are, and your view of reality is often skewed, especially if the person in question has visited harm upon you. Another incredibly important yesod, how when we are hurt or we are involved in a situation which results in pain, how difficult it is to be able to see things for what they are and to recognize that often our judgment of the situation and our judgment of others is so fundamentally skewed. And therefore, says the Rebbe, if I know that because of my pain, because of the hurt, I'm not seeing things objectively, I'm not seeing things for what they are, I have to be so careful to abstain from judgment and certainly from cursing the other. All right, so we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow in Ayin Beis. Shkoyach, everyone. I'm sorry? Rabbi. It's very true. It's very true, right? That even more so he was the king, and yet he did. Absolutely.